So, my name is Monika, and I am the professor for risk in international politics and economics. And I am going to host today this reaction panel to the election outcomes in Poland and Slovakia. So we waited for Poland to make up their minds, and now we can talk about Slovakia and Poland together. Really glad to see all of you here. This is a building partnership with the new club on Central and Eastern Europe that you guys have put together, and more questions go to Nadia on this one. So I'm just going to jump right into this conversation. Let me introduce to you our guest speakers. It is entirely my fault that they're not here in person because, well, it was a reaction panel, but I knew that there was going to be an outcome of the election, so I could have organized it with a little more of a head start. But I'm really glad that they are here. They've been talking and explaining the outcome of the elections and the implications for the European Union and globally for the last week. So they've made time to join us as well online. First, we have Professor Monika Süss. She is a professor at Hertie in Berlin and an expert in international security. Then we have Professor Edith Zgut, professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and she's an expert on rule of law and democracy, as well as the wider region. And then we have Balazs Jarabik, who is a consultant for the Dexis Consulting, who has clients. Among their clients is USAID and the Department of Defense and the Department of State. And Balazs is an expert on Slovak politics, as well as on all things that have to do with Ukraine, where he spent most of his time in the last, if not 5 or 10 years. He'll let us know. Okay, so let's make sure that, first of all, we all know what we're talking about. I want to just briefly show you the outcome of the Polish elections. And as you very well know, we have some reason to be joyful, unless you're on the other side of the vote, and then we need to talk. You got to visit me during office hours. So we... as you can see, the opposition, which is formed, the 2023 election results, you can see them right here compared to 2019. The opposition has defeated the incumbent, Law and Justice, and they are likely to form the government. So you have these three parties, the Civic Platform, the Left, and the Third Way Party, that are likely to form a coalition after successful negotiations. Whereas the incumbent, the Law and Justice Party, has won the popular vote, so the plurality, but not a majority, and they are most likely to go into the opposition unless they don't. But that's not, let's say, the most likely situation. So what does this mean, right? PiS has been in power for a long time, and if this were to happen, like so, if this change now takes place, this will have repercussions both for the way Poland has been governed in the last decade, as well as for how Poland perceives itself and is perceived in the European Union and in the transatlantic relationship. So I'm going to just give the floor now for the first round of comments on this to our panelists. I will make them just a little bit bigger. Yeah, stop sharing the screen so you can see them all. And I'm going to start with Professor Süss. And my first question goes to you, and to tell us a little bit about what do you think are the implications for Polish democracy and its role in the European Union.
Thank you, Veronica, for the invitation. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm in Barcelona currently, so I'm tuning in from here. And I wish I could have been with you in Bologna, but I think we can make it happen in the future. So you made an excellent introduction to the elections. So you guys, you saw the results. Let me perhaps start with saying that indeed the stakes of this particular election were particularly high. Veronika mentioned that, let's say, Poland was, of course, and this is not a mystery to anyone, was declining in terms of democracy since 2015, so since the Law and Justice Party took over the power in the country. And of course, we were afraid, by we, I am referring to the more liberal and pro-Europe-oriented part of the society, that a third term of the Law and Justice Party will be just, not only more of the same, but it will somehow even lead to a greater stagnation and greater decline of democracy in the country. And this would, of course, have had certain dangerous repercussions for the future of the European project as well. So the stakes were high, and this is, of course, one of the reasons why also the turnout in this particular election was exceptionally high. So almost, I guess, 74% of Poles went and voted. And this is the highest turnout in the history of Poland. So there were even jokes, I think it was on a platform that used to be called Twitter, that Kaczynski managed to mobilize more voters than communist regimes, actually, because the turnout was even higher now than by the end of the Cold War, so by the end of the 80s. And now we have a situation in which indeed the Law and Justice Party still managed to secure, let's say, the victory, if you count the seats in the parliament, in the Sejm, so in the lower chamber of the Polish parliament, but they are not able to create a majoritarian government, even with the potential coalition partner, which is a party called Konfederacja in Polish. We can, of course, talk about them more in the Q&A if you wish. But the message is that they are not able to govern. So there was also one question whether Confederation would actually want to govern together with PiS, but now, even if they would have, they don't have enough votes. So this is out of the picture for now. And we are looking into a coalition government formed by 3 parties. We have the Civic Coalition. So this is a party led by Donald Tusk. You might have heard this name before. Donald Tusk was Polish Prime Minister many years ago, and then he went to Brussels and he was the president of the European Council for 2 terms, so for 5 years. And 2 years ago, he came back to the Polish politics and he managed to secure a great number of votes for his party, so for the Civic Coalition. Then the second biggest party at the opposition camp, let's say, of the picture is the so-called Third Way, Poland 2050. And they managed to secure almost 15% of votes. And then there's also a new left, so the Social Democrats, basically, and they also managed to secure over 26 seats, I think, in the end. So altogether, it gives the opposition, the 3 opposition parties have a stable majority. And this is the most important message, of course, out of the elections. We can, of course, also talk why after, 8 years of a democratic decline and, well, also, let's say, some questionable economical decisions, PiS still managed to secure so many votes, because I think this is one thing that is also quite interesting if we took a broader perspective on the elections. So what will happen now is basically that, according to the Polish constitution, the president of Poland is free to nominate a prime minister. So President Duda, which, again, this is not a mystery, he comes from the Law and Justice Party, so he can basically decide over the course of next week whether he will still assign a prime minister from the Law and Justice Party, because it is the party that won the elections in terms of seats, with knowing, although, that there is no chance that the government will be created under a prime minister coming from the Law and Justice Party, simply because the lack of majority. He can also straight away give the decision to nominate Donald Tusk as the party leader of the biggest opposition party, and let Tusk to create an opposition government. We don't know what Duda will do. Just this afternoon, someone from the chancellery of President Duda announced that the talks will start next week. So Duda will invite all the leaders of the parties that took part in the elections to the president's palace, and they will talk about the possible government options, let's say. So this is how it's gonna work, and I think that we will be seeing a government being launched within the next month, hopefully. Final sentence, because we all want to have lots of time for the Q&A. I just wanted to mention, because I got several questions going into this direction from the Western media. So let's be clear, it won't be an easy term for the opposition government for several reasons. Just two of them. First of all, as you know, as the name says, it will be a coalition government, and the three parties, they differ a lot on various issues. And of course, they will manage to, you know, align their preferences, because, you know, there is like a more important fish to fry to some extent, but it won't be easy. So it will take time. It won't be easy, and we have to keep this in mind. And secondly, there is still, under the Polish constitution, there is this possibility that president can veto laws that will be then passed by Sejm. So in order to override president's veto, Sejm would need to vote with a majority of 3/5. So this is a huge majority that the opposition doesn't have at this moment in the parliament. So as long as Duda remains as the president of the Republic of Poland, it won't be, again, easy for the coalition to govern. And the third aspect, perhaps, and I will stop here, we also cannot forget that the polarization in the society is also very high. That's also one of the reasons why we actually witnessed such a high turnout. But again, this also won't make the life of the coalition government easier. And yeah, I will stop here for now, but I'm happy to answer all the questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Monika. And that was a perfect setup for us, because you started with the good news, right? The good news. And now let's talk about the real news, which is that this government will be extremely challenged to create changes. And the risk to reform would come, of course, like Monika mentioned, from the institutional setup. So the semi-presidential republic, where the president is still president until 2025, can veto legislation that the parliament can only overturn 3/5. But also there's the Constitutional Tribunal that has been packed by PiS, the outgoing party. And then second, there's the risk of coalition politics pretty much disappointing a lot of the voters, because coalition politics is the expression of democracy in many ways, but it also means that nobody gets what they want. And I would just give one example. One of the most important issues in this elections were women's rights. It was the second most important issue after the economy. And as this coalition forms, you would have a more, let's say, progressive party in Donald Tusk's party that will have to govern with the third way. That is still a very conservative, well, not as conservative as PiS, but a conservative party. So they will not be able to deliver the kind of changes that part of the population is waiting for. And third, continues to be a capture of the media, of the electoral authorities, of businesses, of the judiciary. So this is where I'm going to give the floor to Edith to tell us how does she think that this government is able to reverse any of these changes in a meaningful way, and where would be the most important obstacles?
Thank you, Veronica, for putting this together and having us here today. Greetings from Warsaw. I'm sitting at the Polish Academy of Sciences now, and I cannot help but reflect a little bit on the atmosphere here, because I want you to give the big picture about how my expert bubble feels right now after the election outcome. I have to tell that there is a certain relief among colleagues, just to start a little bit with the good news, because there has been a lot of concern in the last couple of months that PIS was just about to capture certain flanks of the institute where I am employed, the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, financially. So there was a lot of anxiety here accumulating ahead of the elections, and most likely this is not going to happen. So I just wanted to touch base by that just to give you some hint of what is going on the corridors of this institute right now. But getting back to the questions, and cycling back to a couple of points which has been said already, I would like to further pressure on what Monika said and bring it further to what are the implications for Europe with regards to that. I think we can establish that the EU potentially gain itself a key constructive player with a potential new government, which will be hardline on Russia and might become an even stronger military power sitting at the table. And most certainly, I think this is the key. No matter what, the systemic outcome of this change in power will be, there will certainly be a change in the rhetorics with the new government when it comes to Eurosceptic populism. So most likely Poland is going to get out of this curve that we have been witnessing in the last 8 years, because this was exactly the politics which was dominating PIS, not only rhetorics, but also politics towards the EU. And this new government might have a completely different approach, which means that the Polish relation with the EU could improve significantly. Not only because we're talking about the 6th largest EU member states and the biggest in Central and Eastern Europe, but most likely Tusk government would do everything in order to regain influence at the core, the Polish influence at the core of the EU by repositioning Poland in the Council as a mid-sized regional powerhouse. But as it has been already mentioned, this new government will face several challenges down this road. Both Monika and Veronika has already alluded to this kind of division within the opposition when it comes to certain topics. And although the bulk of the oppositional parties are pro-European and supportive towards an ever closer union or the Eurozone itself, the Peasant Party not that much. And PSL, the Peasant Party, is part of this third wave, one of the third pillar of the opposition, as Veronika mentioned, which has been traditionally reaching out to a more conservative, more Eurosceptic kind of electorate in the rural areas. It means that this is not a clear-cut picture of how a Tusk government would be able to coordinate within, the power flanks of a future government. And we have to take it into account that this is a very strong cultural frame in smaller settlements. Like these parties are arguing that Poland will lose its national identity and sovereignty, and we're going to die out under the flag of the European Union. And it still resonates very well in the rural areas. Challenge number 2 I wanted to mention, and it has been already touched upon by Monika, is that no democratic revolution is going to happen overnight. So Europe cannot expect that. Restoring the rule of law and improve the quality of democracy, it will be a real uphill battle for the new government. And the opposition, although it will want to push through reforms in order to get the EU recovery funds as fast as possible, but it will have to maneuver, as it has been mentioned, in a very difficult institutional environment, which is still dominated by the allies of PIS, not only President Duda, it has been mentioned, but also the Constitutional Court, the Central Bank, or the Media Council, which is overseeing the operation of the public broadcaster, among others. So I think what we need to look at is that most likely a new government would need to focus on feasible, I would say, strategic steps, which would not necessarily require legislative, I would say, actions, because it's going to be extremely difficult, as it has been mentioned. And one of this is foreign policy. Because when it comes to foreign policy, there is no direct need to push through specific legislations in every kind of case. So in many cases, the change would not require legislative action. For instance, like repositioning Poland in the European Council when it comes to supporting more condemning Hungary, taking a different type of approach openly towards Hungary with regards to Article 7, for example. So we might see another form of what I wanted to mention in this regard is that although there is no large need for legislation here, we still might see a power struggle between a new government and President Andrzej Duda in this field, because foreign policy traditionally is carried out both by the government and the president. And although President Duda has been so far rather focusing on bilateral relations with the United States and Ukraine, right now it can try to elbow himself to gain a more decisive role in this procedure when it comes to alignment with the EU, for instance. So that might also have an implication on how the new government will be able to balance this. And it leads me to my last third point on what does this election mean for Hungary in the region, because I think Veronika also wanted me to talk about a potential realignment between the two more advanced authoritarian like countries in the EU. And I think we can also establish that this is going to be a significant game changer for Viktor Orban, who might be running the last full-fledged autocracy within the European Union. And although we've seen that the diplomatic bilateral relations have cooled down already before the elections, but the ongoing EU procedure still glued them somehow together strategically in their fight against the European Union. And this is exactly what seems to be over now, because Viktor Orban has gained a serious adversary in the person of Donald Tusk. They know each other forever. They have been clashing back and forth on the future of Europe and the values of the future of integracy for years. And most likely Poland is going to be speaking up against Orban's pro-Russian politics a lot louder and clearer than it has been happening before. And another contributing factor could be that this new potential government will most likely depict itself as a successful opposite of Viktor Orban illiberalism. So there is going to be this kind of competition of who is going to be gaining more influence, and Donald Tusk will try to position Poland as a, so to say, a laboratory of redemocratization that can regain power within the EU Council, even if it's going to be a very difficult uphill battle, as I said. This is going to be something which will have an impact on the regional cooperation as well. There could be a reshuffle within the Visegrad Group too. So I think most of the experts would expect that Poland and Czech Republic might create a more constructive tandem within the Council, while Viktor Orban is, as we see it, further isolating Hungary within the European Union. Just think of him 2 days ago being in China and shaking hands with Vladimir Putin and appeasing him. And even, Balazs can tell us more about how Slovakia can come in the picture as a potential ally. But I think even if Robert Fico forms a coalition in Slovakia, it will be a lot harder for Viktor Orban to form a strategic defense alliance with a member state that is, first of all, not under Article 7 procedure, second of all, part of the Eurozone. So the strategic priorities and economic kind of priorities are markedly different, but I'm sure that Balazs is going to tell us more about that. So to conclude, I think that this new coalition would be a very first step on a very long kind of road towards redemocratization of Poland. It will probably take years, as it has been mentioned. And I think the European Union has to be patient with regards to this procedure and formulate some sort of a midterm rundown with Poland and with the new leadership of the government, if it can make it on the next European Council summit in December. And I'll probably stop here and happy to discuss it further in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith, and thank you for making the transition towards Slovakia. Now that we know that there's likely to be not a lot of love between Hungary and Poland, my question to Balazs is whether Hungary has found a new partner in Slovakia. So tell us a little bit of what's going on there.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for the invite. And it's a great company, really. Let me start with also good news from Slovakia, and then we can move to the real news, as you say, Veronica. No bad news, just real news. So the good news from the Slovak elections a few weeks ago already is that, compared to the expectations, there is no far-right party in the parliament. Republika is out, which was a big surprise for everyone, including myself. There are far-right fringe elements on the Slovak National Party, which is, I would call them a saloon nationalists. And during the last Fico government, they were in the government coalition with the Hungarians. So it is not really no longer really that far right as it used to be, let's say 20 years ago, but on that list, there are fringe far-right elements which got into the parliament. So, it's, we are not entirely far-right, but the most structural party is out. It's also, I would consider, very good news that the progressive Slovakia, I think it's a kind of a unique situation where a progressive party, openly progressive party, has almost won the elections. It came second, but it was very close. And I think the bad taste from the elections were really coming from the exit polls, which were showing that they may win. The elections, in the end, it was a false alarm, and it was not really the case in the end. There's a lot of criticism toward polls, but I have to say that most of the polls before the elections were actually correct. So only the exit poll, which, Robert Fico, who was being accused as a head of mafia, being hunted down after the Kuciak murders a few years ago. So to the surprise for a lot of people, he had the hidden voters. Which is also showing that part of the society is actually feeling that they're not welcome if they would vote for Fico, which kind of giving you a little bit a lamp into, and also the former prime minister, Igor Matovic, who almost 90% of the society credits. He has a 90% disapproval rating. So credits for all the shenanigans, the former government coalition were going through. He just made it with Roma votes. So we even half serious, half joking, saying that finally we have the first Roma party in the parliament as well, because half of the MPs are actually coming from the Roma representatives. So it's also a good news, although, I personally think that his party after his performance should be out, but at least a certain positive aspects are there as well. Obviously, the real news is that Robert Fico, who was 3 times prime minister already, is back into power. He is the one who is forming the government coalition. It's also like how close were the elections that, he's only able to form a coalition with the Slovak National Party, as well as the splinters from his own party's mayor a few years ago, Hlas or Voice, and also the former prime minister Pellegrini. So, the real situation, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, at least, if anyone was getting information about the Slovak elections in the Western media, I have to say that most likely has a very one-sided opinion that, the mafia, pro-Russian Fico returned and now is going to form an axis of evil with Orban. It's not going to be that easy. It's not that black and white. Fico is populist for sure. He was running on the Ukrainian platform, meaning opposing military aid, which kind of putting him into the same or almost putting him in the same platform with Orban. He was also speaking a lot about peace, but at the same time, he's also very pragmatic. And Slovakia, as Edith mentioned, is in the Eurozone. Also, in the past few years, we have a full-fledged police war. So Slovakia facing a lot of rule of law problem. And actually, Fico's main priority is, as he said, quote unquote, clear the law enforcement structures from those who are kind of going against him, as well as his interests over going into the past few years, which is ultimately, I would say, is going to put him in a conflict with the European Commission. And I think Slovakia will be finally going to face rule of law conditionality, or may face rule of law conditionality. At least the Commission will have to react if he's going to enact into a real clearance of the law enforcement structures, which I think this is at least what he promised, and this is really his priority. When it comes to, and now your question, Orban, the two men has ups and downs. They have been prime minister. Fico has been prime minister 3 times. In 2010 and 11, they had a huge conflict over the status law and the passportization of Hungarians. At the time, for example, it was the Fico government which did not let the late Hungarian president Solyom into Komárno, into the Slovak side of the same city. So they really have ups and downs. Fico, by his admission, and I think this is what we can expect from him, he is a bit more sovereignist. Therefore, he may clash with Orban when it's needed, according to the Slovak interest. So it's not that black and white when it comes to this. Fico is also going to have, he said no to military aid. He also said yes to military contracts. Slovakia, for example, is working on various howitzers which are being paid by the Norwegians as well as the Danes, which Fico said he's going to honor simply because these are commercial contracts. And Slovakia needs the money, and also he doesn't want to have, this is not military aid per se. I don't think that he's going to run more, by the way, also very important, when Slovakia did the gas reserves for Ukraine. I think it was in 2015 or 2016, he was the prime minister. So, which I had to kind of, tell to my Ukrainian friends as well as to the particular in the government, and that's also him, and his pragmatism. I think he's going to stay. So what to expect in the current situation? Obviously, the Polish elections are bad news not only for Hungary, the Hungarian government, but also Fico. Why? Because Fico's main priority when it comes to the region is the reinforcement of Visegrad cooperation. And this is where, obviously, if there would be a peace government in some form in a coalition, Orban as well as Fico, that would be a different situation when now it's going to be Tusk. Fico and Orban is not going to be any strategic value. And so therefore, I don't think that Fico is going to go for it. And B, you still have, the big Slovak, most important Slovak neighbor is the Czech Republic. So, the relationship with the Czech Republic and all this is going to be also as much determining than the relationship with Orban. And lastly, the least thing what Fico wants to have in the current, he also very much emphasizing very weak public finance situation for the Slovak government. So he needs to consolidate public finances, therefore access to the Euro funds and the EU funds is going to be absolutely crucial. So the least what he needs is exactly being in the situation when Hungary is or Poland is and not having access for this or that reason to the EU funds. So I think, it's going to be kind of a balancing act on his side. Obviously, we're already seeing just, the government is not yet formed. The Slovak president just refused to name one of the big, a truly interesting, bizarre character for Ministry of Environment with nothing to do there, obviously. So it's a full political and cultural war in the media as well as in the society already going on. So that's obviously is going to poison the Slovak society and may make the otherwise pragmatic Fico more a hardliner. We yet to see how this is going to be working out. Very important how the European Commission is going to react on all these issues, whether it's going to find very quickly rule of law issues with Slovakia, which Slovakia admittedly, I would say, has, but if the Commission will find immediately after the elections, that may kind of create a little suspicion that they're reacting on the elections and not on the actual issues, which are ongoing for years. So that's how pragmatic and what's going to be the approach of the Commission is also going to be important. In order to say what I want to say, if Fico has nowhere else to go but to Orban, that he most likely will go. But if he will any room for maneuver, then this is going to be not his first choice by far.
Oh, this is excellent advice. I hope they're hearing you when you give them this sort of advice as well. Now, of course, these conversations are very important in themselves because we need to know what's happening in these countries and how the citizens of these countries are going to live and manifest their human rights and citizenship. But these are also very important for the European Union and for continuous support for Ukraine. So some of our guests have also hinted at that. I also have a poll that we've recently done with YouGov at the European University Institute, where we see that support for Ukraine has been dropping this year compared to last year in countries that are considered big supporters as well, including Poland. So even if Poland is still very high in providing support for Ukraine and at the level of their citizens, when it comes to integrating Ukrainians in the labor market or including Ukrainians in some social benefits, but also enlargement towards Ukraine, that is going down, even in a country as supportive of Ukraine as Poland. And this is, I would say, another risk that we need to take into account. To what extent the outcome of these elections are going to reverse or amplify these trends of questioning the future of Ukraine in Europe. So if I can start the other way around, if that's okay, Balazs, because it's maybe here you've also given us a lot of nuance on where Fico stands, and you've already told us a lot about the government and how pragmatic they are. But the population of Slovakia is one of the least supportive of Ukraine, together with Bulgaria, and unfortunately increasingly so Romania. So where do you see the trends in the society going there?
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, the Slovak society is indeed quite divided over Ukraine. I have to say that, in the first months of the war, there was a big reversal of the change, that the Slovak population overwhelmingly supported Ukraine as a reaction on the Russian aggression and the Russian invasion. Simply, especially those who were always kind of having a pro-Russian position in Slovakia, which is a kind of political tradition in this little country since the 19th century, where the Slovak nationalism was really looking at Russia as the mother Slovan state, and this kind of methodology is really working up until now. It's very much it's being taught in the school, and obviously the school system was not really being forthcoming to change very quickly, these kind of things. But I see like 75% of supporting Ukraine immediately the first month. So I would say also, obviously the impact of Russian, as well as even more the homegrown propaganda and narratives, but also as, Slovakia was going through difficulties connected to the war, the energy prices, inflation, particularly inflation more than the energy prices, because that's the government more or less swallowed, but the inflation was significant. And, I also telling to my Ukrainian friends that, look, if the Slovaks overwhelmingly wants peace, it's not necessary because they're pro-Russian. They just want the war in the neighborhood to be stopped. And they're not thinking about it's beneficial for Ukraine. Ordinary people, obviously, but this is beneficial for the Russians currently or for the Ukrainians. So the government is coming in this, situation, and what really was a differentiation for Fico, and the reason why Fico was winning the elections, is really the Ukrainian topic. And what Fico did is that, in Slovakia is also a overwhelming media support for Ukraine, which is a big contrast to the society, which is prone to at least being polarized or being divided. The Slovak media is unisono supportive, to the extent that it doesn't really supportive into any discourse about it. And here comes Fico, who is completely against the huge media headwind, pick up the ball, which is called Ukraine, and start running with it. And that's what really made a lot of difference for people who are saying, our domestic issues, inflation and all this is going to be the most important thing. This is, I would say, similar to what Orban did last year when he won the elections. Also, one of the reasons why Orban did last year is because of the Ukrainian topic. So the actual situation is not that black and white, again, that people would choose between Russia and Ukraine, but they're really factoring in a number of domestic issues. Again, inflation, what we think about peace, how they, a lot of people are really having an issue in trust in media simply because they are very one-sided, and it's a lack of discourse about key issues, particularly foreign policy issues, which the Slovak elite are not willing to do.
Thank you, Balazs. I would like to go to Monika next. Maybe could tell us also from the perspective of international security and the European Union themselves, right? So what do you think Poland is going to do now under the likely leadership of Tusk to help support Ukraine towards enlargement? Do you think that they will align with the idea of bringing Ukraine in with full rights, with staged accession? What is your view on this?
Great question. Thank you, Veronica. Before I answer your question, let me just add 2 sentences on what Balazs was saying, because I think it's a striking difference between Slovakia and Poland, actually. So I'm not an expert at all on Slovak policy, but it strikes me that Polish society seems to look at Ukraine totally differently So perhaps there is like a huge difference in the threat perception. So Poland traditionally has perceived Russia as a security threat, and it's, you know, it's a continuously perceived as a threat since the end of the 80s, basically. And this is something that I would say is a cross-party consensus. So it's not only the society, but also very much among the, let's say, major parties. And then also, I think that what resonates with the Polish society is very much the right to self-determination of Ukraine. So, you know, all these discussions, whether Ukraine has to start peace negotiations with Russia. So on that, I would say that Poland is very clear that only Ukraine has the right to decide when to start negotiations, whether to accept any loss of territory. So there is, like, I think, a consensus in the Polish society and also among the Polish political forces on that issue. So I just found this differences quite interesting. So your question on enlargement, again, I think it's a complex issue, right? Because on one hand, Poland and Tusk, of course, but also the Law and Justice Party actually always supported the membership of Ukraine. But I think that at least the Law and Justice Party, they really didn't think it through, what it will mean if Ukraine joins the European Union. For example, if we are talking about, you know, funds for farmers or agriculture, I mean, the institutionalization of the agriculture funds in the membership countries. So I think this is not something that the government of Poland so far has really been thinking through. Now it will have to change also because let's say the prospects for Ukrainians membership are actually quite clear now. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight, or of course we need, you know, several years to make it happen. But eventually, I mean, at least from my perspective, I think it's going to have to happen, and not only for Ukraine, but also for Moldova, and of course from the countries from the Western Balkan. So I think that you know, Poland on one hand is, as I said, very much supportive towards enlarging the European Union, especially when it comes to Ukraine, simply because we are, you know, if Ukraine joins, then we do not have the external border of the European Union anymore. So simply a security issue, and that is very much important there. But also because to some extent, and I think that again resonates very well in the Polish society, is, let's say, quite similar faith of both societies. So we've been through this before as a Polish society, and now we can assist the Ukrainian society in reforming their country in order to prepare for the enlargement. So this is one thing. On the other hand, there's of course the whole discussion on the institutional reforms that the EU has to implement before we can actually start talking about enlargement. And so far, the Polish government, as you probably all know, had a very different opinion on whether the EU has to redesign its institutional framework in order to be prepared for enlargement. So, for example, the Law and Justice Party strongly opposes any movement towards more qualified majority voting in foreign and security policy, but also in other areas, as, for example, taxation. So I think there is this mismatch, let's say, between supporting Ukraine as, you know, a potential member, but on the other hand, being quite reluctant if it comes to reforms. And to be honest, I also don't really see the new government, for example, supporting qualified majority voting. So Tusk, as the president of the European Council, was actually always very clear that, you know, unanimity is there to stay, at least when we are talking about security issues. So, of course, for example, the left party within the coalition that will be formed in the near future, I think that they are very clear that they want the strengthening of the European integration. They haven't mentioned QMV, but I mean, many aspects of their program within foreign and security and European policy actually hinted to that. So I think they could be open for this, but I'm not sure that Tusk will. And in the end, of course, he will have, let's say, the final word, probably. So this is at least my hunch. So I think this would be, again, a complex issue for Poland to push. But again, I think again, that was Edith actually was saying in the change of rhetoric. I think you mentioned this, you phrased this way. So I would like to highlight this because I think that indeed the tone of the new Polish government would be dramatically different of what we've seen over the last 8 years. Just give me one. Let me give you one example, and then I will stop. The grain issue. So the ban of, importing of grain from Ukraine towards the European countries and then also farther to other continents, it was actually an issue that many experts were saying that could have been solved by talking about it. So actually, it could have been solved when the European Commission, Poland, Ukraine would have sat together on the table and actually discussed what can we do with that. But it wasn't, let's say, the style of the previous Polish government, or actually still current, but you know what I mean. So I think and this will change very much, because the Tusk-led government will definitely try to be extremely constructive, because they already announced they want to be back in the European mainstream when it comes to decision making. And in order to be in the European mainstream, especially when you are not within the Eurozone, which is also another aspect that we can talk about, then you have to somehow find a common language with the partners, even if your interests are not exactly the same as of the other, let's say, bigger countries like France, Germany, or perhaps Italy or Spain. So I think that we will be seeing lots, of negotiations over these issues. But again, I'm sure that they will gonna find common ground. Final sentence, sorry for that. What I think is also important is that the approach of the West has to change. So we, for example, now, I mean, of course, the Franco-German tandem, this is not the way the EU politics should have been done actually within the recent years, but we still see, some manifestations of that. And I'm not saying this is wrong, because of course we need a strong collaboration between France and Germany on many issues. But I think this is really the high time. And I think now with the Polish election results, we just got a chance as the European Union to somehow, redesign perhaps the power plays within the European Union. And I'm also sometimes not really sure whether it will be so easy, for Germany and for France to kind of let it go and to accept new partners at the decision-making table. But I think this is something that we have to do in the coming years.
Thank you, Monika. I couldn't agree more that Germany and France should be much more cooperative when it comes to decision-making about countries of the East and also outside the European Union. So before we go to questions from the audience, I want to wrap up with Edith here, our conversation, and I've saved Edith for last, because I'm going to talk about the rise of the far right as well in the European Union, and how these elections contribute to that. Because this isn't an issue about Central and Eastern Europe. Again, the countries of Western Europe also have far right parties that are now ranking first in the polls, right? Belgium, Austria. In France and Germany, they are in second position, fighting for first position among the electorate's preferences. And Italy, not to mention Italy, we all know what's happening in Italy. And there are other countries as well where this trend seems to be going in that direction. Of course, Hungary is there as well. So I'm just wondering, with all our optimism about the change of rhetoric and so on, to what extent is what's happening in Poland likely to contribute to a change in that trend? I would be very pessimistic, but maybe you can say something else. And where do you see this election outcome also impacting the election outcomes for the European Parliament in June?
Okay, thanks. I try to play further with this fast and loose, with the good news, bad news, and start with the good news. I think one of the most important lessons learned that we could tease out from this election outcome is that, there is a durability of toxic polarization with panic mongering and hate mongering within the society. So what we have seen here, I think many of my colleagues would agree that although that the government was doing everything in order to tilt the playing field and float the whole public sphere and the discourse with hate mongering towards others, Monika mentioned how the situation with Ukraine with regards to the grain also deteriorated a little bit. So there was also a hint of kind of exploiting identity-based anxieties towards Ukrainians and Ukrainian refugees at the very end of it, not to mention disinformation. So this was somehow undercut in a sense that although the media structure and the whole campaign has been underpinning the argument of the government in this regard, it didn't bring more people to cast a ballot on behalf of the government and the far right as we were expecting. So I think this is something which is an interesting thing to look at. We are still trying to tease out the data, but everybody was expecting that in smaller settlements where the government is traditionally stronger and the far right and everything to the right of PIS is traditionally stronger, is going to be mobilized by not only by the key messages, but also by the referendum. And what we have witnessed is that although there were mobilization in the smaller settlements, it did not help these parties. So it looks like that, so to say, that this type of steam is fading out from this type of message. At least here, the opposition and civil society organizations were successfully undercutting this type of toxic polarization by reflecting directly on the everyday problem of the the Polish society when it comes to corruption or the lack of fuel at the gas stations of state-owned companies which were misusing power and public funds and so on and so forth. So I think this is something which could eventually, at least here in Poland, give us some sort of an optimism in a sense that this type of regimes have a durability when it comes to far-right polarization and hate mongering. But getting back to your questions about the concerns, and I wanted to cycle back to Ukraine a little bit, while we see that this potential new government might realign the relationship with Ukraine and get back things on track, we have to know that we're going to have a really tough customer new opposition in the form of PIS and Confederacja, which means that I think eventually it could have a very negative impact and implication on the campaign, on the discourse on the European Union, and so on and so forth. I personally assume that given that this party has been populist Eurosceptic since the very beginning of establishing this party, this is going to be a downgrading spiral, both in terms of strategies, rhetorics, and policy initiatives. And this is eventually could have a negative implication also on public sentiments towards the enlargement. As far as I've seen the last numbers, the majority of the Polish society is really positive towards the idea of enlargement, so about 67% or so, which is great. But we know that both ideas about enlargement and both pro-European attitudes are multi-layered in a sense that there are other things which could have an implication and an impact on people's sentiments towards these issues at the end of the day. So I expect a very nasty campaign with regards to that. And what would that mean on the configuration of far-right populist parties on the level of the European Union? This is really not my turf, so I wouldn't go into that at this point. But eventually, I think that would shift Jarosław Kaczyński's parties further towards far-right parties. The question is how to deal with issues that are genuinely dividing them, like the world, like approach towards Russia and so on and so forth, because I think these are still something which are, so to say, undercutting their potentials and capabilities to form joint further forces within the European Parliament. So I wouldn't go there yet.
Thank you, Edith. It's time for questions from the audience. We still have about 25 minutes to go, so please. Can I switch the cameras now or no? Yeah. Or yeah.
Hi, my name is Georgi Kent. I'm an MAIR student, first year here. And I want to ask about kind of Poland's EU accession process and comparing it to a potential Ukraine accession process. Specifically, you mentioned agricultural subsidies as a potential sticking point. And from what I understand is that when Poland was joining the EU, one of the biggest question was how it would incorporate into the agricultural subsidies process. And so I wondered how they kind of navigated that policy. And because I've heard from others saying at the time, I was like, oh man, this is going to destroy the subsidies policies if we let Poland in. But they managed to figure out some sort of arrangement and the policy is still in force. And so I'd like you to comment on that a little bit more. Thank you.
Should we get another question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Massimo, and I'm a first-year Maya student. And my question is pertaining to Slovakia and Robert Fico. So I was very grateful that you mentioned a little bit about the murder of the journalist Jan Kubiak. And I was just curious, thinking from my perspective of thinking of Fico as this mafia-like boss who is riddled in corruption scandals, and you saying that that was a little bit only half of the story. I'm just curious if you could comment a little bit about what actually then led to his election. Is it that the Slovak population is so much more inclined to maybe withhold aid to Ukraine that was trumping maybe some of the domestic policies? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. So thank you.
And I'm going to get a third question, so our guests can also have time to choose among them.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Daria Lange. I'm a first-year Maya student. And my question is, you talked about that there are multiple challenges for Poland in imposing new legislature. And I was wondering, how do you think there's a risk that with it being difficult to introduce new rules, returning the rule of law and the constitutional court being kind of still occupied by people from the peace, do you think it will be difficult for them to, if it's difficult for them to change legislation, do you think maybe next year the peace or the next election cycle, maybe we'll see again more of a vote for the peace party? And are you worried about that at all?
All right, so Balazs, do you want to answer first about the question on Slovakia?
Yes, and thank you for the question, because I didn't want to leave an impression that it was all about Ukraine, and that's why Fico, it's exactly not the case. But indeed, he made a difference with campaigning with Ukraine vis-a-vis a huge media headwind. But how to say, we had an extremely pro-Ukraine government. We also had a very incompetent government, and as there's not connection between the two. But the government, which did great things for Ukraine, did very bad things. They hugely mismanaged the COVID crisis with scandals unbelievable in fighting in between. And they also, did a lot of things for Ukraine, but didn't do much things for the Slovak economy. At the same time, I remember, and particularly how the state is being managed. I remember when we were frantically trying to reserve vaccination appointment for my mom, and it was a competition between thousands of pensioners online. It was hugely frustrated. And now the government is doing the same thing in the past 2 years with the green energy related transition and support for ordinary people. It's just amazing. How come you're making people compete for amount of vaccines or for the amount of money you have? And that's so mismanagement and incompetence. Robert Fico actually didn't need to do much. He was just watching the government to destroy its own support base. And again, the former prime minister's disapproval rating is over 91%, which is very funny because his party got 9%. So exactly remaining things. So that's why the public finances, I already mentioned, is in a very bad situation. There were even opinion pieces in the Slovak media, let Fico win, because if the progressives have to manage this mess, then it will be very bad for them. So just give you a snapshot, the progressives were in opposition, they didn't get into the parliament in the last elections. In the previous one, it was actually our liberal conservative government, the anti-Fico parties, which managed and provided the infighting and incompetence for the rest of the population. So the Ukrainian moment and being, the society is being divided and polarized by the war, by the Russians' war in Ukraine, is just a moment or an episode, but it's really not the full story. So the full story is unfortunately not that good. Watching, by the way, how Fico is struggling to have a government coalition, I have to say, that I think the elections caught surprise even the Fico people. They're lacking cadres. They don't have names. The Ministry of Economy is now going to be the former Deputy Minister of Interior is going to take over the Ministry of Economy, which contains the energy portfolio as well, which is a huge portfolio both. And so they don't have people. They don't have an economist. They're struggling to find someone for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that is going to be an uphill struggle for the government to provide but Fico, being pragmatic, he also had, being a head of mafia is very much coming from the liberal mainstream. It's not really accepted generally. It's a political attack than an established fact. And for a lot of people, this also was not proven. And again, I already mentioned that Fico had the hidden borders exactly because of this. So that he's the mafia and all this was very much the media line, the mainstream media line. But a lot of people essentially said, we cannot have another term of this chaotic management. We need to go back to certain governance standards. And that's for them still Robert Fico. And this is not his fault. Unfortunately, this is the fault of the other parties. If I can make a parallel to the Polish elections, I wasn't that surprised that PiS lost simply because A, the polls were showing, but B, like PiS made everything possible to, if I may, and to piss off everyone. So essentially destroyed and confused his power base and support base and destroyed any potential coalition. I frankly didn't, Monika, Edith, correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't find Confederacja would be happy to be a coalition partner for PiS in the end. So change was in the air, and in both sides, both in Slovakia and in Poland, it was the ruling party which screwed up things to the extent that the protest vote against both of it was huge. In Slovakia, it was Fico who was the most benefited from as the opposition, as the main opposition from the protest vote, and in Poland it was Tusk and essentially I would highlight the third way, because the third way was making a huge inroad with almost 15% of the vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Balazs. And they're not going to put you in charge of the PR for Slovakia after all the
I'm sorry about that. I mean, it's like, and to be frank, and this is my government too. I mean, not this one, the previous one. So it's kind of my frustration as well, how you can do these kind of things in such a bad way. So yeah, sorry about that.
We have a question on the agriculture and subsidies reform of the EU. I see Edith is unmuted. So do you want to take that?
Definitely not that, but I'm happy to pick up on the legislation and what could be feasible, what couldn't be feasible topic.
Go ahead.
That's okay. Okay. So just very briefly, as it has been mentioned many times throughout this conversation,
whatever the new government would try to do, it's going to be an uphill struggle. And there's going to be this very limited kind of maneuvering to pass any kind of new laws, not only because of President Duda, but other institutions as well. And of course, the elephant in the room, not that much elephant because we touched upon it, is the judiciary and the constitutional tribunal, which is the key in order to move on, to reform the system and eventually get the EU funds. But the problem is that, and I think it's also something we have to really emphasize, is that a potential new government cannot fight fire with fire. So it cannot do exactly the same thing that has been done by the PIS government at the very beginning, to intervene directly and start to replace judges just because they say so. So instead of intervening, using this method, they would probably need to wait to let the system to self-correct itself. And actually, the history has taught us that it also happened throughout the communism, and when the communism collapsed in 1989. So some of the judges, which have been part of the infrastructure of the previous regime, have been eventually diverting or converting towards the new one. I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm saying this is a window of opportunity to see whether it's feasible or not. Also because, as I said, this is a slippery slope, which is ethically, morally very questionable if a new government is going to that direction. The other issue that could be somehow revolved around is the media. And as I said, the public broadcaster is a very difficult case because there is a new media council which is overseeing the functioning and the democratic functioning of the state media. And also because there is no consensus within the oppositional parties what exactly and how exactly to do anything about it. There were also ideas whether to abolish it fully and completely or keep it in a different kind of configuration. So there is, I think, a lot more question also around the ways of doing it, let alone the space to maneuver, whether it's going to be possible within the given institutional design. And one more point I wanted to mention is that throughout these 8 years, private media ownership in Poland has been also over-politicized to a certain extent, because the government has been encouraging state key firm players to buy up media. And this is exactly what happened to the local media. PKN Orlen oil giant bought it and turned it over and made it a propaganda mouthpiece. Also, the question is what to do with that, whether the government would be willing to try to pass it on towards, you know, more like more independent private actors or not. But again, it's going to be not as easy as we might imagine right now, because it's going to be like, as I said, it's going to be like an uphill battle. So I'm sorry, can you hear me? Because I think my internet is...
Yes, you're okay.
Okay. So probably I just stop here. Just wanted to flesh out the difficulties and then how what might be the key directions. But I assume that this is not going to happen for quite some time. It could even take years to reverse this institutional design.
Monika, if you could.
Yes, I will try. Although
yes, it's a difficult question.
It is, and I think that actually, I mean, I'm not an expert on enlargement, so let me be clear on that, but I will try. But before I start elaborating on this, just one sentence of, let's say, two fingers to what Balazs was saying about, you know, not being surprised that PiS lost the election. I kind of agree with you on that, of course, but I think that also what really make the difference this time were, I mean, really lots of campaigns promoting going to the ballots. So this is to the ballot boxes. So basically, I never seen in Poland so many different non-governmental organizations, but also, you know, independent press, also to some extent universities, that all been saying the same: go and vote. They weren't saying go and vote for whom, but they weren't saying go and vote. And the turnout was much higher than 2019. And it was actually especially high among young people and women. So Veronika mentioned the issue of, you know, abortion and women's rights in general. And I think that the anger at PiS policies at this aspect really has angered lots of Polish women. And this was also one, I think, of the key problems for PiS and for the election results. Now, to the common agriculture policy to some extent, so I will do my best to answer your question. So what I know for sure is there are certain things. So to start with, the common agriculture policy of the EU, many experts argue for quite some time that it has to be reformed because it's not sustainable anymore. And when Poland joined the EU in 2024, there were certain transition periods for Poland. So Poland did not initially get all the subsidies that, for example, the Western European countries were getting, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm quite sure that I'm not mistaken on that. And so I think this probably would be the same for Ukraine. But I think that first of all, we have to reform common agriculture policy in order to be able to let's say accept Ukraine. Also because Ukraine is twice the size of Poland, and the agriculture sector of Ukraine is quite strong. So it won't be problematic for Poland only, but also for the other countries where agriculture is a strong, let's say, branch of economy. And the same was actually also true for the access to the labor market. And I think, again, it could be problematic. I mean, it could be, I don't like the word problematic. So it will be a challenge, let's say, when we will be talking about, you know, accepting Ukraine. So just to give you an example, I think Germany was actually one of the last countries that opened its market for the new countries, and especially for Poland, this was important. So when I'm not mistaken, I think it was 2011, so many years after the accession, when Germany actually decided to open its labor market. And this is also one of the reasons why 2024, so after the accession, so many Poles went to the UK and Ireland because their labor markets were open. So to somewhat wrap it up, I think that the EU has to really institutionally prepare for accession of not only of Ukraine, but I mean Ukraine, because of its size, will be of course more challenging than, for example, Moldova. But I think that certain institutional changes will have to be made within the EU in order to be able to enlarge.
If Veronika, if I may, on this agriculture issue, I have a data on this. Actually, before the accession, the large.
Thank you.
So before the accession, 60% of the EU budget was the common agriculture policy. Now it's less than 40%. And so it was exactly as Monika was saying, the EU has to has to go through a certain restructuralization, you can call it reform, but certainly when it comes to the budget. The issue with Ukraine is a bit different, is that if Ukraine agriculture is so big, even vis-a-vis the EU, that it will be really distortive when it comes to the overall market conditions. And so there was, a few weeks ago, there was a leak, a common EU policy, informing by leaks, about an EU document of calculating how much Ukraine and the agricultural sector would be entitled to, according to the current common agricultural policy rules. And it was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you can take a look, it was in Financial Times, 186 billion in the next cycle, out of which almost 100 billion would go to agricultural subsidies, if that wouldn't change. Now, to give you a little perspective, Poland maximum contribution from the EU budget is 82 billion in 7 years. So we face a huge issue, a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity, because according to certain climate activists, if the climate is changing so fast and in this way, then Europe actually, or the EU, will need the Ukrainian agriculture. So far is not the case, but let's say in 10, 15 years, it might actually be the case. So, a lot to digest, as well as to restructure.
Thank you all. There are any more burning questions? Now it's time to make, okay, so there are no more burning questions. Well, to be truly honest, you guys have covered so much, and I'm so grateful that you have brought us all to speed. We will have Ambassador Martin Selmayr join us in February to have a conversation about how we can reform the EU ahead of the EU elections. So we will be covering that from a different perspective as well. Thank you guys so much for making the time to be here with us. I know you're extremely busy right now, and I couldn't be more grateful. Join me in a round of applause that I'm not sure you can hear. And I can't wait to have you here in person. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Looking forward to be there with you.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.